Is the Democratic Party a cult? Well, I made a video talking about whether or not the Republican Party is a cult, so it's only fair I do one on the Democrats. Now, disclaimer, I'm someone who's more sympathetic to the Democrats. You might be too, but we still have to admit that there are some components of the Democratic Party, some ways in which they've behaved that are really not desirable and that are rather cultish at times. So let's do a little dive back into the Democratic Party in the early days of Trump. So Trump gets elected in 2016. It sends shockwaves down the country and especially through the Democratic Party's spine. And at times it really felt like the Democratic Party was only obsessed with taking down Trump, only focused on being against Trump, saying we're the hashtag resistance. So this is one of those things that's like, I sort of understand because the guy was a concerning individual. They didn't want him to be president. They were afraid of what he might do as president that would harm people. But at times it didn't seem like they paid all that much attention to the policy and rather just presumed that he was a Russian agent, just someone put into the White House by Putin. And that was all they needed to know, and that was all they needed to mention in order to explain their opposition to him. And it's like, no, you have to have more than that. Because what if it's not true that he's an agent of Putin, a Manchurian candidate? We need to focus on the policy. And I honestly felt like up until the start of the 2020 election, so around the 2019 Democratic primaries, policy was not that big of a focus of the Democratic Party. And that was concerning. So were they a cult that favored any particular Democratic candidate, a person? No, not really. They didn't really have a leader in particular to worship. This was before any Democratic candidate had announced they were running for president. So they just kind of went out on their own and said, we hate Trump, we hate Trump. And they thought that was enough. But you can't build a party on opposition to one guy. And when you build your party around opposition to one guy and not standing for affirmative policy positions, you do come off rather cult-like. You do. So, the Obama era had ended. They were obviously big fans of Obama, although in 2014 during the midterms, they distanced themselves from him to kind of say, hey, well, his approval rating is low. I'm not like him. So that's something that shows that, hey, they're not totally a cult. They are able to push away from their unpopular at the time, leader. So during the Trump years, early on, they didn't really have a firm leader to stand up to Trump. I mean, there was sort of Nancy Pelosi, maybe Adam Schiff. Hillary Clinton had just lost. She refused to go away. So the Democrats, they nominated Joe Biden in 2020. That whole primary process, though, was kind of concerning. You had Democrats acting like, we need to nominate the most electable person. You had Biden supporters. I remember at the time on Twitter, and yes, it was Twitter at the time, there were Biden supporters on Twitter who couldn't even explain why they were backing Joe Biden. It was actually kind of insane. So I saw someone who was a Bernie supporting Democrat asking Biden supporters, could you name 5 policies of Biden's that he's advocating for that are a reason for you voting for him? And this one pro-Biden account unironically responded saying, number 1, beat Trump. Number 2, beat Trump. Number 3, beat Trump. Number 4, beat Trump. Number 5, beat Trump. And it's like, really? Really? Can't you be a little deeper than that? Can't you think about what policies you want to get through once a Democratic president beats Trump? Because if they struggle to get good policy through, that increases the odds of Trump winning in 2024. And that's exactly what he did. So the Democrats lined up behind Biden because they viewed him as the most electable. There was a lot of name recognition as well among the voters. They said, well, he was Obama's vice president, so we need to get behind him. He's old, so he knows how things work in Washington, D.C. So there was sort of this, rallying around the idea of electability, of the fact that, Biden has won elections before as the vice president at least, so surely he could win as a president, and he did. Now, his previous presidential runs had turned out poorly. He didn't make it past the primaries. He got eliminated fairly early on. He was not a finalist in 2008. So I thought that at the time, I was paying attention to the Democratic presidential primary as someone who was not really a Democrat. I was a little more right-leaning back then, more of a center-right type. And I was just intrigued more by some of the more progressive candidates, some of the more outsider candidates, people like Andrew Yang, Bernie Sanders, Tulsi Gabbard at the time. And I'm just like, what is making people so won over by Joe Biden? He's old, he's generic, he's almost as establishment as they come. And at times he struggles to put sentences together. Now it's even worse, obviously, but I just did not know the appeal of this guy. And then Super Tuesday rolls around and Biden just obliterates Bernie Sanders. And I'm like, what's going on here? Bernie Sanders is actually running on policy. Biden's just running on, hey man, Jack, I don't like Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a very mean man. He's a bad guy and he's the worst president, so I'm going to beat him like a drum. That's what he said, beat him like a drum. If I'm the nominee, I'm going to beat him like a drum. And of course he did. But the fact that he was only campaigning on that for so long, it's like, really? What's going on here? So Democrats, throughout most of Trump's term were just saying hashtag resist. Another issue that concerned me was the kids in cages thing. Now, they loved pointing to the kids in cages issue. They said, oh, there are kids in cages under Trump. How can you support Trump? That's so terrible. And it's like, okay, it's fair to point that out, but at the same time, the kids were in cages under Barack Obama, and they still were under Biden. And yet, people got pretty silent. People on the Democratic side went pretty much silent about that under Biden. It's kind of like how under Trump, if there's still high inflation, Republicans are probably going to be silent about that too. So in a sense, it's like, yeah, both parties are guilty of that. But really, you treated it like kids in cages was the worst crime against humanity under Trump. You didn't mention it under Biden. And when people pointed out that it started under Obama, you just turned a blind eye to it. And of course, a lot of conservatives would do that. A lot of Trump backers would point out the Obama thing and point out the Biden thing more as a whataboutism or to own the libs, to be like, see, Trump's not the only one who does it. But at the same time, they're also kind of providing broader context, and that's important. You can't just be against something when only one president, only one party does it. So that was a bad look for the Democratic Party and for the left. During Biden's early years, I felt like the Democratic Party was drifting away from some of the more concerning cult-like aspects that I observed. In Trump's first term, I thought it was good that they didn't, storm out in Biden hats, being like, Build Back Better, rah, Biden, yeah, Biden daddy, let's go. Just simping for the president just because he's of their political party. They kind of went silent for a while. The midterms rolled around and Biden's approval rating was really low, and yet Democrats still did fairly well. Then the presidential primary, or so-called primary, rolls around for the Democratic Party in 2024. Starting in 2023, Biden announces that he's running again, and there are Democrats backing him. Basically, the Democratic Party shut down a lot of the competition. They shut down RFK Jr., they shut down Marianne Williamson, they shut down any meaningful competition for the Democratic nomination in favor of their old boy, Joseph Biden. So he got the nomination, he got a lot of votes, but did he really get those fairly, necessarily? Would things have been different if they had actually allowed more of a primary to take place? I think so. I think there's good reason to think so. So Biden becomes the nominee. He has this disastrous debate with Donald Trump back in June. Then the calls start coming for him to drop out. Senator Mark Warner of Virginia was one of the first people in the Senate, a big ally of Biden, who said, look, Biden needs to drop out for the good of the party in this election. And even some huge Biden supporters on X were saying Biden needs to drop out. He cannot be the nominee. It'll be disastrous. We'll be letting Trump win way too easily. Trump did end up winning, but they thought that it would be way too easy of a win for Trump if Biden were to remain the nominee. Rob Reiner on X posted that he loves Biden, Biden's great, but that he needs to drop out and the nomination should go to someone else. And the pro-Biden Democratic accounts on X threw a temper tantrum over this. They were going absolutely insane, saying Rob Reiner must have dementia for not supporting Biden, for wanting him to drop out. I was so shocked that so many Democratic Party X users were so aggressive about keeping this guy who struggled to complete a single sentence as their nominee on X. Like, we have to defeat Donald Trump. We have to run the best candidate to defeat Donald Trump. And yet these people are just like, oh, yeah, no, this guy who just on the debate stage a week ago said, we finally beat Medicare. So that was really embarrassing. Finally, Biden drops out on July 21st. Then the Democratic Party, they can't really hold a primary. They've got to get someone in time for the convention. They nominate Kamala Harris without a single primary vote. And I know a lot of Republicans will point this out very cynically, to dunk on Kamala Harris, to say she's the real threat to democracy. Of course, Trump's not a threat to democracy. Kamala Harris is a threat to democracy. She didn't get a single vote. And it's like, well, they didn't have time to cast votes. So Kamala Harris becomes a nominee. Everyone's all like, oh yeah, we have to line up behind her. Biden endorsed her. So, and maybe that was sort of a thank you to Biden for dropping out that they were giving him by lining up behind her. Because let's face it, there are candidates that could have done better than Kamala Harris in this election. She was tarred with the problem of incumbency, tarred with being associated with Biden, sort of tarred by her own doing in a sense when she said she wouldn't have done anything differently from Joe Biden. There are many different ways that she could have said that, many different ways that she could have phrased her support for Biden and her general support for her policies, but she chose to go about it by saying she would not do a single thing differently. So, do you sense a pattern here? The pattern throughout most of 2024 was, we don't want to upset the dear leader. We don't want the American people to feel like we've abandoned him and he's too senile, he doesn't know what he's doing, he's enacted some policies that are questionable. And that ultimately went back and bit Democrats in the butt. It did. You can't just do that. So the American people, I think, and this was just one component of the reason for Harris losing, but they saw a little bit of cult-like behavior within the Democratic Party, a bit of, no, you cannot breach our dear leader. He's actually a spring chicken. He's full of energy. He might as well be a 23-year-old man. He's great, even though he's 81. Behind closed doors, he's a dynamo. Cenk Uygur was ripping them so hard for this and their efforts to protect Biden. And they weren't paying attention to the fact that his approval rating was in the 30s. The 30s. When was the last time an incumbent president got reelected with an approval rating in the 30s? Yet they were still like, oh yeah, this guy is the best candidate. God forbid you ask them why he was the best candidate. They would say, because he beat him before. That's basically it. He beat him in 2020. So obviously now in 2024, when he's had a horrendous debate performance, when the economy has continued to not do super well, not as bad as the Republicans say it was doing, but not do super well. Obviously now he can still beat him, right? And the kicker was that the Democrats had internal polling showing Biden losing with 400 electoral votes in favor of Trump. Biden getting less than 200 then. Trump, 400 electoral votes. The last time a candidate got over 400 electoral votes was in 1988. George H.W. Bush just steamrolling Michael Dukakis, the guy who posed for that picture in a tank. So it would have been embarrassing if Biden were the nominee. It really would have been. And yet some of these people on X were stubbornly insisting, no, he's the only one who can beat Trump. He's the best candidate. We love you, Joe. You're so special. You're the man. You beat him before. You'll beat him again. He would not have beat him again. Spoiler alert. I'm sorry to say. And some of his own people in his circle are even still assuring him, you would have beat Trump. Yeah, you would have beat him. So then Kamala Harris's nomination comes around, and yeah, they line up behind her. There don't seem to be many people saying, oh, I wish Biden were still the nominee. They just fell in line behind Kamala Harris. There weren't people saying, bring Biden back. That didn't seem to be a thing at all. People were pretty content with Kamala Harris. People liked her pick of Tim Walz. But it didn't seem that people in the Democratic Party were very introspective of their choices. I talked to a good friend before the election, and she said, I think Kamala Harris was a great candidate. I'm really confident she can win. And I said, well, I think she could win, but do you really think that she's like one of the best candidates? I don't know. She's too associated with, basically establishment DC with Joe Biden, and that could harm her. Her rhetoric at times is faulty. She's got a past of supporting some policy positions that the American people view as cringe. For example, sex changes for undocumented immigrants. So, yeah, I was skeptical. Some Democrats were not. It seemed like they were just like, oh yeah, this is our nominee. We have to pretend she's the best thing ever, and that of course she's going to win against Trump, and that she's the best candidate we could have chosen. I just don't know. I think if you have someone like Gretchen Whitmer, J.B. Pritzker, Andy Beshear, Tim Walz as the presidential nominee, I think would have been better than him as the VP nominee. Josh Shapiro, one of them who at that point would have seemed like an outsider. They could have made a stronger case against Trump while also not seeming like, hey, I'm just going to be a term 2 of Biden. You know, Harris, of course, is younger than Biden, so she was able to speak a complete sentence, and that was a breath of fresh air for a lot of people. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to make the difference. So the Democratic Party tends to just line up behind people that they view as the most electable, and that at times came across as rather cult-like. It did. Just backing someone because, oh yeah, the Republicans don't like them, they'll beat the Republicans. Yeah, this is great. Without really scrutinizing the policy. That's a problem. That's a problem. But having said that, so I've just given you the reasons why I think the Democratic Party, arguably, reasons that support the idea of them being a cult. Now I'll explain why they are not a cult. So the Democratic Party, let's face it, is more issues focused than the Republican Party. It just is. They focus more on issues rather than people. Small minds discuss people, big minds discuss ideas. And the Democratic Party seems to focus more on ideas. I did just point out how they focused on just hating Trump throughout most of his first term, and how they focused on propping up Biden throughout the end of his first term, or his only term. But during the Democratic primary, things were a lot closer than the Republican primary in 2024, believe it or not. So let's look at the 2020 Democratic primary versus the 2024 Republican primary. These were both open primaries. There was not an incumbent. Donald Trump steamrolled the opposition in his 2024 primary. You had these Republicans showing up to the debate stage, and Trump didn't even need to show up, and he won almost every state. Now, Biden, he did very well in the Democratic primary, but he still had to fight. Remember what happened early on. So Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders basically tied in Iowa. That was the first primary, the first caucus, the Iowa caucus, the iconic Iowa caucus that gets things started off. So Biden took an L there. Biden took an L in New Hampshire. Bernie Sanders, I believe, won New Hampshire. And then Bernie Sanders won Nevada. So and Bernie Sanders won it big time too. Biden took second in Nevada. So the first 3 contests, Biden got his butt kicked. Then South Carolina rolls around. Jim Clyburn helps Biden out. And from there, it's pretty much smooth sailing for Biden. But keep in mind, during the primary, there still was a lot of beating up of Joe Biden. The other candidates were going after him fairly aggressively. I remember even Kirsten Gillibrand, the senator from New York, very typical establishment Democrat, was roasting him back in July 2019 in a debate. Elizabeth Warren going after him. Bernie Sanders going after him for supporting the Iraq war in 2003. So, yeah, a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters, a lot of Elizabeth Warren supporters, they pointed out the problems with Biden. They're like, why do we want to nominate someone who supported the Iraq war in 2003? That's just insane. He also supported the Anti-Gay Defense of Marriage Act. And yeah, he said stuff like, nothing will fundamentally change under his presidency. Obama campaigned on hope and change. Biden was Obama's vice president. So Biden's out here saying, actually, no hope or no change. Nothing will fundamentally change. There's a disconnect here. So yeah, they were right to point that out. They criticized him for it. And even if they fell in line behind him during the 2020 election, it was mostly just for the sake of defeating Trump. And also he started campaigning more on policy issues in the 2020 election. For example, COVID was a huge thing. He talked more about a climate change agenda that would actually really help the environment and that would be more aggressive than Obama or Bill Clinton pursued in their presidencies. And in general, he stuck to that as president. He talked about tax policy that was generally appealing, saying if you make more than less than $400,000 a year, your taxes will not go up. So generally a pretty progressive platform in 2020, not quite within the league of Bernie Sanders, but he actually worked with Bernie Sanders on some of that policy. So yeah, were progressives being cult-like to fall in line behind Biden? No, not really. He kind of won them over on some issues. So in the 2020 election, I don't think that the Democratic Party was a cult-like party at all. I think they were focused on issues. They were focused on how do we make it out of the woods of the pandemic. And they saw Trump as being a guy who was enabling the pandemic, refusing to do stuff like mask mandates, telling lies about COVID, saying, well, it's just like a cold, even though far more people were dying from COVID than died from the cold. So yeah, they just felt like, I mean, based on the overall situation, the totality of the circumstances, COVID being a big part of that, Biden was the better candidate. He won them over in a way that Hillary Clinton did not. And of course, Democrats did criticize Biden early on in his presidency. They did refuse to fall in line. So, for example, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema continued to refuse to fall in line behind Biden's agenda. An example of a moderate Democrat that also was questionable with regard to his support for Biden's agenda was Jon Tester of Montana. Rest in peace, Jon Tester. He was just defeated in this election, a random Democrat in a deep red state. But yeah, Biden faced quite a bit of opposition from his own party. Let's also keep in mind, Biden withdrew from the Afghanistan war. And a lot of mainstream media, a lot of people within that media who are typically very loyal to the Democratic Party criticized him for that. They did. This is a guy who they have every reason to support at that time. He's a Democrat. He was Obama's VP. And he beat Trump, and they love him for beating Trump. They still kind of do. But yet he withdrew from the Afghanistan war, and that enraged them. The media just went nuclear on him. And it was at that point, around that point, that Biden's approval rating entered the point of no return. It never fully recovered. It rarely ever got above 50%. His 57% approval rating that he enjoyed during his honeymoon phase, sometimes even a little bit higher if I'm not mistaken, it tanked. So the Democratic Party, yeah, they attacked Biden both from the left and arguably from the right. They attacked him from the right in the sense of, oh, his foreign policy, this is just nonsense. You can't just withdraw from this war. Remember, it was a Republican president who got us into Afghanistan to begin with. So the media was attacking him for withdrawing from a Republican Party war. A Republican war. They're saying, no, stay in this war that a Republican president got us into. So, yeah, that's yet again an example. And you may not agree with them. A lot of progressives don't agree with them. But it's an example of the media not just being a Democratic Party propaganda outlet. Not quite in the same way that, for example, another media outlet, Fox News, would be a Republican Party outlet. I mean, Fox News pretty much always attacks Democrats and always props up Republicans, whereas CNN and MSNBC often prop up Democrats, but sometimes spend a fair amount of time dunking on the Democrats and even propping up Republicans. So that's an example of Biden being attacked from the right. He has continued to be attacked from the left within his own party throughout the rest of his term his stance on Israel and Gaza, being way too much of a Zionist, favoring Israel far too much in this conflict that had taken so many Palestinian lives. Tim Walz, so he was a vice presidential nominee with Kamala Harris. He said that he understands people who voted uncommitted rather than voting for Biden in the Democratic primary. That is huge. People were voting uncommitted to show support for Palestine, basically to say, Joe Biden, I do not like the way that you have been handling this Israel-Gaza situation, so I'm voting uncommitted. I'm not voting for anyone. This is ridiculous. You need to change course on Israel-Gaza. Other Democratic politicians, such as Rashida Tlaib, also went scorched earth against Biden over this. They called Netanyahu a war criminal. So they still remain Democrats, by the way. They didn't switch parties. They didn't become Greens or Independents. They're still part of the Democratic Party, and there's still so much dissent within the Democratic Party. Now with Trump in office, the Democratic Party is still kind of fighting amongst itself. They haven't become this resist Trump cult that at times they seemed to be during Trump's first term. And in fact, Senator John Fetterman and Joe Manchin, those guys are like, yeah, let's give Trump a chance. We're going to root for him to succeed. So then, yeah, you do have other Democratic senators who are like, yeah, no, we want to go to war with Trump. I recently saw Cory Booker and Tim Kaine taking a more harsh stance. Democratic senators like Mazie Hirono, Tammy Duckworth really going hard against some of Trump's nominees. So yeah, there's still the hashtag resist stuff going on within the Democratic Party, even if they're starting to be drowned out by Democrats who are capitulating to Trump. And then we've got the more Trump sympathetic Democrats. So yeah, there's plenty of division within the Democratic Party. It seemed like there was a Republican civil war earlier on with Trump versus DeSantis. Now it seems like they fully united behind Trump. But the Democratic Party now that Kamala Harris has lost, they're all pointing fingers at one another about reasons for why Kamala lost and why Trump got reelected. They're disagreeing with each other about how they should go about fighting Trump, if at all. And in fact, AOC called out fellow Democrats recently for being too reflexively anti-Trump. I mean, and she's not a Trump loyalist. She has referred to Trump as a neo-Nazi as of the year 2024. A neo-Nazi. The language doesn't get much more unequivocal than that. So, yeah, the Democrats are at each other's throats a lot. Far too much for me to consider the Democratic Party a cult. Under Obama, I also thought that, yeah, at times they got a little too... They kissed butt a little bit too much toward Obama. There was a little bit of vibes focus. But there was also focus on policy. Like, people really liked the Affordable Care Act. You can stay on your parents' health insurance plan until you're 26. So many of my fellow students these days will point out how much they appreciate that. They'll make jokes like, oh, I'm about to turn 26, about to lose my health insurance. And they'll also talk about, how they approve of some of his climate change policies. Even if there's a little bit of focus on vibe, like, oh yeah, he's such a nice, charming man. I think it's outweighed by the support for Obama's policies and the fact that he arguably saved the country from the Great Recession, actually, with his stimulus bills and basically getting the economy moving again via spending. We were out of the Great Recession by 2011. And there's still plenty of criticism of Obama, too, from left-leaning Democrats for his foreign policy vis-a-vis, well, many countries, actually. Libya, Syria, Afghanistan. He continued the Afghanistan war, drone strikes. So, yeah, drone striking an American citizen at one point even. Not many people remember that, but yeah, he got a lot of mud thrown at him over that. So under Obama, I wouldn't say the Democratic Party was a cult. Under Trump's first term, at times the Democratic Party acted cult-like. Under Biden's first term, Biden's only term, towards the end of his presidency, they got a little cult-like in their defense of him, but eventually came to get behind Kamala Harris. And now I think it's very much safe to say that the Democratic Party is not a cult. The Democratic Party is in disarray. They can't seem to agree on much. They don't have a firm leader to worship. So they can't worship any leader because they don't even have one to begin with. Hakeem Jeffries, that guy's not going to be their leader, at least not right now. So they've just got these senators who are waging war against Trump's cabinet nominees. And that's about it. They don't have anyone. They have 3 people on the Supreme Court, 3 appointed justices, and minorities in the House and the Senate. Mike Johnson is the Speaker of the House. John Thune is the Senate Majority Leader. They have no one to look up to. So we kind of just got to wait till 2026 to see who emerges as the Democratic leader, and maybe we'll see if they start to get a little cult-like then. But yeah, I think that the Democratic Party is quite a bit less cult-like than the Republican Party. Please watch my video on whether or not the Republican Party is a cult. Ultimately, I conclude that neither party is a cult. If one of them is a cult, I would say it would be the Republican Party for their endless support of Trump, trusting him over religious leaders and family members, arguing that he was sent by God, and Trump even saying that he was saved by God. after the July incident in Butler, the assassination attempt against him. We don't have an equivalent to that within the Democratic Party. We just don't. We don't have a Democrat saying he or she or they were sent by God. We just don't. So, or saved by God even. And I'm sure that Democratic politicians have had near-death experiences before, and yet they don't go and say, I was saved by God to fight for Americans and to fight against the evil Republican Party. They just don't do that. So there's a world of a difference between the Democratic and the Republican Party. Although I argue neither are cults, I think that the Democratic Party is far less cult-like. Admittedly, I am biased, but I gave a thorough assessment of areas where I think the Democratic Party has acted cult-like, and I hope that you appreciate that, and I hope that you understand where I'm coming from when I say that they are not a cult. Let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for watching. Please like, comment, or subscribe to the channel, and I look forward to speaking to you in my next video. This has been The Morris the Merrier. Out.